Let me just close by asking about the Israeli lobby. And I know that you have challenged Walt and Mearsheimer's contention that the Israeli policy lobby is able to drive American foreign policy. Many people see it as a force that makes it extremely difficult within the American political establishment to defy, let's not call them Israeli interests, but certainly right-wing Israeli interests.
Well, the problem with discussions about the lobby is they typically take the either-or form. Either, some people believe, that the lobby determines U.S. foreign policy. That's the famous tail wagging the dog theory. Sometimes it takes rather extreme forms. I spoke last week at a conference in Chicago, the American Muslims for Palestine, a very decent group of people, and there was somebody sitting next to me. She did not only think that the lobby determines American foreign policy now, but she was convinced that, in her words, her terminology, not mine, the Zionists, in the form of Louis Brandeis, was responsible for World War I. Well, that's a stretch. And then there are others who say that it's U.S. foreign policy interests that determine all U.S. policy in the region, and the lobby is, in effect, a cipher. It doesn't really wield any power when it comes into conflict with U.S. interests. I think the picture is not one and not the other. When it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, if we can use the term, the local conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, I think it's true, it's the lobby. Because however you configure this term, national interest, it's impossible to conceive, as far as I can tell, any notion of U.S. national interest, whatever it might mean, that can include support for the settlements, the occupation, the colonization by Israel of the West Bank. A simple thought experiment. If tomorrow, miracle of miracles, Mr. Netanyahu announced Israelis are packing their bags and they're moving back to the June 67 border, it's very hard to imagine anyone in the American administration who would be unhappy with that decision. You know Mr. Obama would be very pleased, and stupefying narcissist that he is, he would take credit for it. Okay, that's the local conflict. And there I think it's reasonable to say, as Mearsheimer and Walt do, that the lobby is the operative factor. But then, in my opinion, Mearsheimer and Walt take a huge leap. They then say all of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is dictated by the lobby. And their most aggressive claim is that the U.S. attack on Iraq was formulated, designed, machinated by the lobby. Well, let's just look at the basic facts, which nobody here, I think, will contest. They're pretty straightforward. Everybody agrees that the principal architects of the attack on Iraq were Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld. President Bush, he was upstairs, PlayStation 2. He wasn't deeply involved in the attack. And Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld, they are clearly pursuing, as they understand, U.S. national interests. They are extremely focused, hardworking, and it's very hard not to admire, in my opinion. They are committed to a goal, namely U.S. national interests as they understand them. I read through Mr. Cheney and Mr. Rumsfeld, as well as Condoleezza Rice. I read through their memoirs, each of which runs to about 800 pages. Rumsfeld's in his own way, he's a very impressive character. He comes in every morning to work. He puts in a 15-hour day. He doesn't like to sit. He stands at his desk. He is very focused, very committed, as is Dick Cheney. They are not opportunists. Say what you want about them, but unlike Mr. Obama and many people who call themselves liberals, they do have principles. When President Bush is trying to decide who is going to be his vice president, one of the candidates is Cheney. And Cheney goes to meet with him. He interviews the people. And Cheney says, Mr. Bush, I have to tell you, I am a conservative. I am very conservative. And that was serious. They have ideas to which they're deeply committed. You might find them repellent. You might find them repugnant. But in their own way, they are principled. Now, that's by way of long introduction to say, they don't care about Israel. They don't have any affection for Jews. They don't care about the Nazi Holocaust. They care about one thing and one thing alone: how to make, how to promote, how to aggrandize U.S. power, whatever it takes. So how do you reconcile the fact that Cheney and Rumsfeld, by everyone's account, were the principal architects of the war? How do you reconcile that with the claim that the Israel lobby was behind it? So the way Mearsheimer and Walt attempt to reconcile it, they say, but right below the top tier, the Rumsfeld and the Cheney, there was this neoconservative cabal, the Scooter Libbies, the Paul Wolfowitzes, the Douglas Feites, with their distinctively Jewish names. And these were all Zionists working for Israel, and in some fashion or another, they tricked and duped Mr. Rumsfeld and Mr. Cheney into launching this war. Now, say what you want about Cheney and Rumsfeld. You don't like them? Neither do I. You wouldn't want them to babysit for your children? I can understand why. You wouldn't want to meet them in the dark alley? You have a point. But gullible, foolish, trick Rumsfeld and Cheney, who go back in politics 4 decades. Each of them began politics, believe it or not, at the age of 22 or 23. They began, believe it or not, in Richard Nixon's administration. They have a rich and concentrated experience in politics. You don't trick Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. it doesn't happen. The whole theory makes no sense. With all due respect to John Mearsheimer, who's a very decent guy, and during difficult periods in my life, he came through for me publicly. But ask yourself the simple question. They say that the Jewish neoconservatives, they don't claim that they were moles, secret Israeli agents in the U.S. administration. They say Feith, Wolfowitz, Libby, they were open supporters of Israel. That's what they say. Well, if they're open supporters of Israel and working for Israel's agenda, why would Cheney and Rumsfeld put them in the most critical places in the vice president's office and the Department of Defense? Does it make sense that Cheney and Rumsfeld would staff the most critical places in the vice president's office and the Department of Defense with treasonous personnel, traitors, agents of a foreign government? Does that make any sense? I just don't think a moment's reflection, when you look through the record and you use common sense, it can support these claims. Cheney and Rumsfeld attacked Iraq because in their minds, number one, it would be an easy victory, as they called it at the time. They thought it would be a cakewalk, and that it would be a useful demonstration of U.S. power to remind everybody there and also in the world who's in charge. Did it also serve U.S. Israeli interests? Yes, it did. The Israelis were very happy with the attack on Iraq. Not that they particularly cared about Iraq, but at the time, we've already forgotten, but at the time, the attack on Iraq, you might remember, was seen as a way station to the attack on Iran. Immediately after the attack on Iraq, when it seemed to be mission accomplished, they started talking about attacking Syria and then Iran. And so Israel expected that the attack on Iraq would then be quickly followed by the attack on Iran. So there was a confluence of interests. That's true. But when it comes to fundamental U.S. interests, it's the U.S. and U.S. elites that are in charge. And you don't fool them or trick them into launching a war in the service of a foreign power. It doesn't happen.
Thank you very much.